So obviously we're in a biology course, and you might be wondering, why are we doing a unit on chemistry in a biology course? Well, there is some basic chemistry that's worth going over in order to have a foundation for discussing certain processes in biology. The organization, composition, and processes within living things are all governed by basic molecules. So it's worth discussing, what is a molecule? In order to understand the internal structure and functioning of living things, which we're obviously discussing in biology, we need to have a basic understanding of atoms and molecules. So that's what we're going to go through in this unit. And we're starting with matter. So what is matter? All living and non-living things are made of matter. So matter is not just something that makes up living organisms, it makes up everything in the universe. And matter is anything that has mass or weight. Sometimes we use the word weight, which is not interchangeable with mass, but we won't get into that today. And takes up space or has volume. So the liquid in this beaker has mass and it takes up space in the beaker. The beaker itself also has mass and takes up space. So both of those are different forms of matter. Atoms are the basic building blocks of matter. So that's why we're going to discuss atoms today. What do we think an atom looks like? So atoms are so small that we can't actually see them, even with a very sophisticated microscope. So scientists have done lots of experiments that have led us to atomic theory, or what scientists think that atoms look like. An atom is made of subatomic particles, which means smaller than an atom. And there are three types of subatomic particles. Protons, which are positively charged particles. Neutrons, which are particles with no charge. And electrons, which are negatively charged particles. The center of an atom, which is made of protons and neutrons, you can see it here, is called the nucleus. So this is the nucleus of the atom, made of positively charged protons and neutral neutrons. And the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons determines all of the properties of that atom. So this is what an entire chemistry course would be based on. What are the properties of the different atoms and how do they react to each other? And all of that is determined by the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in an atom of that element. In an electrically neutral atom, which does not have a charge, the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons. So electrons, we said, were negatively charged and protons are positively charged. So since negative and positive charges balance each other out, if there was an equal amount of electrons and protons, we would have an electrically neutral atom with no overall charge to the atom. And that's typical, but if it did have a charge, it would change some of the properties. So it's worth discussing electrically neutral. So let's take a look here at our periodic table of elements, which you're probably familiar with, at least you've seen it before. Each of these blocks is an element, and they have atomic numbers. Here in this periodic table, it's in the top right corner. If you have a different periodic table, sometimes they put it in the top left corner. There's an atomic mass for each element, a symbol, a name, and then some other things that we're not going to get into in biology. So what exactly is an element? Well, an element is a collection of atoms that all have the same number of protons. And each element box on the periodic table has a few numbers in it, as I just mentioned. The most important number for each element is the atomic number, which is the number of protons the element has. When the atomic number changes, the element changes. So this is a lump of silicon, which is used as a semiconductor for computers. Every atom in this lump of silicon, since this is a pure element, Every atom in it is going to have 14 protons because that's how many protons an atom of silicon has. That's the atomic number for silicon, 14. And so any atom in here that did not have an atomic number or a number of protons of 14 would be a completely different element, making this a different element rather than just a lump of pure silicon. It would be a combination of a couple of different elements. So find the following items on your periodic table. And as I mentioned, each periodic table is arranged slightly differently. There's an atomic mass, an element symbol, an element name, the electron configuration, which here shows that there are 2 electrons on the first energy level and 4 on the second, for a total of 6 electrons. And we'll get more into energy levels in a little bit here. And then the atomic number, which is again the number of protons for an atom of that element. The other important number in each element box is the atomic mass. And the atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in an atom of that element. So remember, we discussed that protons and neutrons make up the nucleus of the atom, and then there are electrons surrounding it. The electrons are tiny compared to the protons and neutrons. So the nucleus of the atom with the protons and the neutrons basically gives the atom its mass. So when we're discussing the atomic mass of an element or an atom, it's just the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. And we'll do some calculations on that later in this unit. Well, atoms of the same element will always have the same atomic number, but they may not have the same atomic mass because they can differ in the number of neutrons that they contain. So we might say carbon 12, which is an atom of carbon that has a mass of 12. Or we could say carbon 14, which is again an atom of carbon that has a mass of 14. So it's still the same atomic number, making it carbon, but the mass can change. And atoms of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons or different atomic masses are called isotopes. And some isotopes are unstable and break apart over time. These are known as radioactive isotopes. This nuclear power plant uses radioactive uranium to generate electricity. So isotopes have a variety of uses. They're used in industry and in medicine and in energy generation, obviously. So they can be particularly useful because they break down over time. We can measure how they break down and determine things about various processes from that. So in summary, elements are made of atoms, which have properties based on the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in them. Atoms of the same element have the same number of protons, but can differ in the number of neutrons, which would make them isotopes of each other. A compound is more complex than an element. A compound is formed when 2 or more elements are combined. The properties of a compound can be quite different than those of the elements within it. So here is silicon, a solid, obviously shiny solid, and oxygen is obviously a gas. But when those 2 combine, they can create a compound known as silicon dioxide, which is commonly known as quartz. So a mineral found in the ground, and the properties and characteristics of this compound are clearly very different than the elements inside it. A molecule is made of more than one atom bonded together. So 2 elements can create a compound, 2 atoms create a molecule. And a chemical formula uses element symbols and numbers to show the proportion of each atom in the molecule. So here is a molecule of carbon dioxide. It has 1 carbon atom, which we know because when there is no subscript after that symbol, that just we understand that that's a 1. It's understood. And O2 means that there are 2 oxygen atoms. So for every molecule of carbon dioxide, there's 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms within it. And that's the chemical formula of carbon dioxide. And we'll be using a lot of chemical formulas in biology class, which is one of the reasons we're going through some of this basic chemistry. So how are bonds formed? Well, bonds hold atoms together into molecules. So these elements aren't just mixed together, they are actually bonded structurally. And bonds are formed by the electrons on the outermost energy level of each of the atoms, and those are called valence electrons. There are 2 main types of bonds that hold atoms together, ionic and covalent. But atoms can also be held together by weaker interactions. In ionic bonds, valence electrons are moved from one atom to another. So here's an atom of chlorine and an atom of sodium, and this atom of sodium had 1 valence electron, or 1 electron in its outer energy level. It had several energy levels here, and that electron was passed from sodium to chlorine, and that is what creates an ionic bond. So anytime valence electrons are moved from one atom to another, those 2 atoms then become bonded strongly together. In a covalent bond, valence electrons are shared and they orbit around both atoms. This is also a strong bond. And you can see here these 2 chlorine atoms are sharing these 2 valence electrons, and so they are then bonded together. So even though they are the same element here, they are still forming a compound. And this formula would be Cl2. And then there's hydrogen bonds, which are weaker. And these occur when 2 slightly charged molecules are attracted to each other. So water is one of the classic examples of hydrogen bonding. And 2 water molecules are attracted to each other because one side of the water molecule with the hydrogens on it, this is H2O for water, the side of the water molecule that has hydrogens on it is slightly positively charged. And the oxygen side of the water molecule is slightly negatively charged, and that's true for all the water molecules. So this positively charged side is going to be attracted to the negatively charged side of another water molecule, and this is a weak interaction. It's not involving valence electrons, it's just an attraction of charges. So in summary, molecules make up compounds, which are elements joined together by bonds. Ionic and covalent bonds hold atoms together tightly, while hydrogen bonds are a weak attraction. So hydrogen bonding occurs in water because water molecules show polarity. Water is a unique liquid and is crucial for life, which is why we're discussing it in a biology course. Many of water's unique properties are due to its polarity. So polarity is what we just discussed with hydrogen bonding and the 2 sides of a water molecule, but we'll go through a little bit more clearly. A polar molecule has an uneven distribution of charge. So in other words, it has 2 distinct poles. That's how it gets its polar molecule name. So a negative pole on a water molecule and a positive pole on this water molecule, making it a polar molecule. Even though water is an electrically neutral molecule, it is not a charged ion. We talked about charge. If electrons and protons don't match up, then an atom might have a charge. This is not true in water. It's electrically neutral. But each end of the molecule has a slight charge, and here's why. Electrons are shared between oxygen and hydrogen atoms in a water molecule. That's a covalent bond. So they are covalently bonded here. The two hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atom are bonded and they're sharing these electrons here. But because the oxygen atom has a larger nucleus, it takes longer for the electrons to travel around the oxygen atom, and the oxygen atom pulls on them more strongly. And so that gives this side of the water molecule a slightly negative charge because electrons are negatively charged. So because they are not being pulled as strongly to this hydrogen side, the electrons are spending more time over here, and therefore the side is going to be positively charged. So it's got a little bit of a charge to it, but not an extreme amount. So conversely, the side of the molecule with the hydrogen atoms has a slightly positive charge because the electrons don't spend as much time over there. How does this polarity of water attribute to its unique properties? So hydrogen bonds are weak, but they still enable water to have unique properties. This polarity of water causing hydrogen bonding between the water molecules gives water quite a few unique properties. Because of these hydrogen bonds, water is attracted to itself and other polar molecules. So other molecules besides water that have this slight positive and negative charge, water is also going to be attracted to them, because you can picture if there was a molecule over here that was not water that had a slightly positive charge, this oxygen atom was going to be attracted to that. So water is attracted to itself and it's attracted to other polar molecules and substances. Water molecules show cohesion. This is the word that we use to describe water molecules being attracted to themselves. And that's, of course, caused by hydrogen bonding. Water molecules also show adhesion, which is the term used to explain water molecules being attracted to other polar substances. Again, caused by that polarity in the water molecule. So what are these unique properties of water that are caused by the polarity and hydrogen bonding within water molecules? So the first property is that water can creep up thin tubes, which we call capillary action. And you can see this occurring here in this photo. These are cabbage leaves that are put in different mixtures of water and food coloring. And so that food coloring allows you to see how the water is traveling through the cabbage leaves. And you can see that it's being drawn up into those leaves. And that's because the polar water molecules are adhering to the sides of those veins, those tiny tubes, and being drawn up into the cabbage leaves. Water also has a high surface tension. And you can see here, water striders are insects that can walk on top of the water because water has a high surface tension. And so it is easy for very light objects to balance on the top of the water. And that's because those water molecules are attracted to each other. And so it creates a sort of film on the top where the insect is not able to break through those hydrogen bonds and fall into the water. Water has a high heat of vaporization. Compared to other liquids, it takes more heat energy to cause water to evaporate. And that's because those water molecules are being attracted to each other through cohesion, and they don't want to be released into the air. When the water does evaporate, it takes that large amount of heat energy with it. So it absorbs a lot of heat energy while it's being held together through cohesion. So this is why when you sweat, it actually cools your body down, because the sweat on your forehead, let's say, is absorbing a lot of that body heat. And so it's being removed from your body, and it allows you to feel cooler because it's being absorbed by the water. The fourth property caused by hydrogen bonding and polarity of water is that water resists temperature changes. So this is similar to the heat of vaporization, but we're not necessarily talking about a phase change here with water changing from liquid to gas. We're just saying that water is resistant to changes in temperature. And you probably know this if you live near an ocean or a large lake. But if you go to that body of water in the springtime, the beach may be warm, but the water will still be cold. Because those water molecules are bonded together through hydrogen bonding, they're able to absorb a lot of that heat energy before they break apart. And so it's going to take a long time for that water to warm up. Likewise, in the fall, it takes a long time for that water to release the heat energy. And so the water's going to stay warmer than the land in the fall. And then finally, our fifth property is that water expands when it freezes. So because of the way that the water molecules are bonded together, they form a crystal structure when they freeze, and the volume of that crystal structure actually is larger, and therefore the ice is going to become less dense than water, which is why it floats. So in summary, water is a polar molecule, which causes it to form hydrogen bonds. This bonding causes adhesion and cohesion, which create water's unique properties. How does water react in a solution? So we've discussed how water reacts by itself based on its polarity and properties, but how does it react in a solution? Well, let's discuss what a solution is. First of all, when one substance is dissolved in another, it's called a solution. And every solution has two parts: a solute, which is the substance being dissolved in the liquid, and then the solvent, which is the substance that's actually doing the dissolving or acting on the solute, and that's usually a liquid. So in our lemonade example here, if we used powdered lemonade, the powdered lemonade would be the solute that is dissolving, and the water would be the solvent that is acting on that solute. Water's polarity allows it to dissolve many types of solutes, specifically charged and polar solutes, of which there are many, like salts, minerals, and gases. And because of that, it's often called the universal solvent. It is not a universal solvent. It does not dissolve every solute, but because it dissolves so many, we give it the name the universal solvent. Some particles cannot be dissolved in water, but they can be suspended. For example, soil and sediment particles are suspended in water in a stream. They're not dissolved in the water, but they are held within the water and they flow with the water, and then they're deposited further downstream. Water molecules can separate into H plus and OH minus ions, which are charged particles, when they're in a solution. So remember that water molecules are H2O, so they can separate with one of those hydrogen atoms breaking off, and then the other OH portion of that molecule remaining. And when they separate, they can actually recombine back into water. So this is a reversible reaction. So when we write this, we say a water molecule can convert into a hydrogen ion and an OH ion, which is called a hydroxide ion. But these can also recombine and reform water. So that we have arrows going both directions here. Because water forms an equal amount of H plus and OH ions, it's considered to be a neutral solution. So scientists have just made this the bar that water is considered neutral because it forms an equal amount of hydrogen and hydroxide ions, and all of the other solutions are based off of that standard. So how do acids and bases differ? Acids and bases are on different sides of the spectrum of a neutral solution. So none of the acids and bases are neutral, they either produce more hydrogen ions or more hydroxide ions than water. An acid is a substance that forms higher concentrations of hydrogen ions in a solution than water does, and therefore it's going to form lower concentrations of hydroxide ions. For example, HCl is a combination of a hydrogen and a chlorine atom that forms hydrochloric acid. And so because when that breaks apart in water, it forms a lot of hydrogen ions and no hydroxide ions, it's going to be considered an acid. Conversely, a base is a substance that forms lower concentrations of hydrogen ions in a solution than water does, and therefore higher concentrations of hydroxide ions. So for example, sodium hydroxide is Na, sodium OH, NaOH. When that dissolves in water, it divides into sodium and hydroxide. So it's got lots of hydroxide ions, no hydrogen ions. So that's going to be a base because it's got much lower concentration of hydrogen ions than water does. And we measure that concentration of hydrogen ions on a pH scale. Each step in the pH scale is a factor of 10. For example, a pH of 5 has 10 times more hydrogen ions than a pH of 6. So this direction in our pH scale is going to be getting stronger and stronger in the concentration of hydrogen ions and therefore stronger acids. Here is the neutral, and then these are getting stronger and stronger bases, meaning that there's going to be less and less of the hydrogen concentration and more of the hydroxide concentration until we get up to the strongest base at pH 14. So solutions with a pH of less than 7 are called acids, and solutions with a pH of more than 7 are called bases. Solutions with a pH of 7 are neutral, and that's going to be pure water. Acids taste sour as a general category. They are able to neutralize bases. That means when they are mixed, when an acid is mixed with a base, it brings the pH of the solution, the combined solution, closer to neutral. They can be known to corrode metals by eating away at the metal itself. And they have a pH of less than 7 with a high concentration of hydrogen ions. As a category, bases are often slippery. They are able to neutralize acids. In other words, when they're added to acids, they bring the solution closer to neutral. They're also known as alkaline. They have a pH of higher than 7, and they have a high concentration of hydroxide ions. So in summary, water is called the universal solvent because many substances dissolve in it. It also dissociates into hydrogen and hydroxide equally. This means it is a neutral substance, unlike acids and bases. So now let's discuss some special types of molecules called macromolecules. And these are particularly important for our study of biology and living things. Macromolecules, and we get the term macro from the prefix meaning large. So macromolecules are very large molecules composed of carbon and other atoms. So we're not talking about H2O here, we're talking about much larger molecules with lots of atoms in them. Macromolecules are important because living organisms depend on them to survive. There are many types of organic compounds because carbon can bond with itself and other atoms. So these macromolecules all have carbon in them, and one of the reasons that they can form such large compounds is because carbon bonds very easily with itself and with other atoms. So here's a carbon atom. It has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, giving it an atomic mass of 12. And it has its energy levels divided up here. It's got 2 energy levels. The first energy level can hold 2 electrons, and then the remaining 4 end up in the second energy level because the number of protons and the number of electrons in an electrically neutral atom are going to be equal. So there's 6 electrons, 2 in the first level, and the remaining 4 go in this second energy level. And those are the 4 valence electrons. So they can form covalent bonds with many different elements and allow carbon to create chains and rings with itself. So carbon is the basis for living organisms because of this unique atomic structure that it happens to have. Macromolecules are polymers made of smaller units called monomers. So mono means one, poly means many. So macromolecules are polymers. There's many pieces to it, made of smaller units called monomers. This is what an individual little section of the macromolecule is called, an individual base unit. So polymers can be made of only one type of monomer or several different types. So we could have monomers joining all of the same type of monomer joining into a polymer, or we could have lots of different types of monomers joining together into a polymer. So monomers are these individual sections of the molecule, in the polymer is then the large macromolecule. And we divide these macromolecules into 4 major groups when we're discussing macromolecules that are particularly important for living things. So there are 4 major types of macromolecules essential for life: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we're going to take a closer look at each of them. Starting with carbohydrates, these are commonly also known as sugars. So anytime you are discussing carbs in a nutrition environment, these are going to be used in your body as sugar. Their structure is that they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a ratio of 1 carbon atom for every 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 oxygen atom. So 1-to-1 ratio always, and that's going to form a sugar or a carbohydrate. The monomers of a carbohydrate are simple sugars like glucose, fructose, and galactose, and those combine into very large sugars that are known as carbohydrates then. And the polymers that those form are carbohydrates that you're probably familiar with, like starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Starch is probably the one that's the most familiar to you. Glycogen forms in animal cells, and cellulose forms in plant cells. Cellulose is best described as maybe that stringy stuff that comes out of a piece of celery. This is what plant cells are made of, and it's a structural component that we are unable to digest. So this is a simplified structure for glucose, which is one of the monomers of carbon. So now you can see here, this is a monomer, and we're discussing very large molecules here, just as the monomer, the basic building blocks of these large macromolecules. So many, many atoms here, even just in this tiny monomer for a carbohydrate. And notice the ring structure as carbons are attached to each other. The function of carbohydrates in your body is to provide structural support and quick energy. Plants use a complex sugar known as cellulose to build leaves and stems. As I just mentioned, that's that structure in celery that you can't digest, and it's essential for plants to have that cellulose in order to build their leaves and stems and structures. Sugar can be stored in complex carbohydrates to be broken down later for energy. Plants do this in the form of starch, and animals do this in the form of glycogen. As I'm sure you know, breads and pastas are sources of starch, which is a complex carbohydrate. So your body will break those down into simple sugars and it will give you a boost of energy. Lipids are commonly known as fats, steroids, oils, and waxes. Their structure is mostly made of carbon and hydrogen. And they are insoluble in water because their molecules are hydrophobic. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear of. So obviously the molecules are not afraid of water, but they do not mix well with water. Lipids are comprised of one glycerol molecule and 1, 2, or 3 molecules of fatty acids. And so here's your glycerol molecule here, and then there are molecules of fatty acids here, chains of fatty acids that are built off of that glycerol molecule. Lipids provide long-term energy storage. They form membranes within cells. They're used as messengers between cells. So you probably are familiar with these as a bad thing in nutrition because maybe you're trying to avoid fats like butter and oil. But these are essential to making up structural components within your cells and providing long-term energy storage, which is what fat is typically for. It's just that we don't always burn it off in the amount of time that nature thinks that we should. So there are lipids in your cell membranes that are used to recognize molecules that are coming from outside the cell. And without fats, your body is not going to be able to perform that function well. Nucleic acids are the third group of macromolecules. They are made of nucleotide monomers, which we'll discuss in detail later in this year. Each nucleotide contains a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. So it looks like this. Here's your nitrogen base made of nitrogen atoms, a sugar, and these carbon atoms right here are just implied in this ring structure. And then there's a phosphate group attached to that. The function of nucleic acids is to store genetic information in cells in the form of a code. And examples of this in your body are your DNA and RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. DNA and RNA have different sugars in their nucleotides. And this is a model of DNA. And the sugars are found in this brown section around the outside. The nucleotides are found in the middle. And again, we'll get into a lot of detail about DNA later in the year. And then our final category is proteins. Proteins contain not only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but also nitrogen atoms. And proteins are composed of long chains of amino acids. There are only 20 kinds of amino acids, but they can combine to create countless different proteins. And proteins are just so essential to the survival of living things. Each amino acid has an amino group, which you can see over here, NH2, and a carboxyl group, COOH, and an R group, which is unique to each of those amino acids. So this will change, and these two are consistent. So what do these essential proteins do in your body? They regulate cell processes, they form bones and muscles, and they transport materials. So you might be familiar with protein in helping you build muscle or hair growth, but they are essential for regulating a lot of processes in your body that you don't even realize. Proteins get their functionality because of their specialized three-dimensional shape. So this is an amino acid, which we've discussed before, and then those amino acids can wind up into something called a helix, and they can then fold into a structure known as tertiary structure, and they can join together with other proteins to form a quaternary structure. So this is a finalized protein, but the final protein structure here is essential for the jobs that the proteins have to do in the body. So just as an overview here, how does the structure of macromolecules differ? Monosaccharides, or simple sugars, are a basic unit for carbohydrates, and the atoms included in a carbohydrate are C, H, and O, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We'll just abbreviate that. Lipids are formed from fatty acids. They also include carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Nucleic acids are made of nucleotides, and they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then amino acids make up proteins, and they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Just a quick little graphic so you can look at all of the information that we just went over. So in summary, living organisms depend on macromolecules to survive. The 4 macromolecules are polymers made of simple units called monomers, and each contains a different proportion of elements. What happens during a chemical reaction? So the molecules in living organisms aren't stagnant. They're constantly being formed and changed through chemical reactions. And chemical reactions always involve breaking or forming bonds between atoms. The molecules that enter a reaction are called reactants, and the molecules that are produced are called products. In this reaction, for example, iron, which is Fe, its symbol is Fe, and oxygen, gas, O2, combine to form rust, Fe2O3. So here's the rust that's forming, and these are the reactants, and the rust itself, iron oxide, is the product. So reactants go on the left side of the arrow, products on the right side. And chemical reactions can be grouped into 2 types: energy releasing reactions and energy absorbing reactions. Although energy releasing reactions can occur spontaneously, energy absorbing reactions usually can't. They require activation energy to get them started because they need to absorb some energy in order to start the reaction. So these processes help to break apart bonds or form bonds between molecules and are constantly helping those macromolecules be recycled through the body in different forms. Why are enzymes important for living organisms? Well, let's take a look back at proteins for a second. We talked about proteins having a final quaternary structure that was important for life processes, and that's because some proteins are used as enzymes. And in that final structure of a protein, sometimes other compounds can fit into that final structure, and then the proteins can either combine those molecules or break them apart. Enzymes are proteins that act as catalysts, which speed up the rate of a chemical reaction by reducing the amount of energy needed to start it. So we discussed that the activation energy sometimes prevents a reaction from happening. Enzymes can help to reduce that activation energy required and speed up a reaction. Many essential chemical reactions would not occur without enzymes. And again, these are reactions that have to occur in your body constantly. So each enzyme has a special shape. This is just a model illustration of that quaternary structure that we discussed when we were talking about proteins. And it can accept a molecule called a substrate. So here's the substrate that's being attached to that enzyme. and it's attached to the enzyme's active site. I can see there's a little typo here. This is the active site of the enzyme. And when that substrate is accepted by the enzyme, it fits into that active site. That enzyme is able to either form bonds in several substrates and bond them together, or break a substrate apart into different products. In this reaction here, it looks like we've got a large substrate and a smaller substrate, and when they both fit into that active site of the enzyme, we now convert that into 3 products when we only started with 2 reactants. So those bonds between those atoms are being broken and rearranged. And there's 2 major types of reactions caused by enzymes. Synthesis, when molecules are joined together to form a larger product. So here you can see we have 2 substrates. When they join in the active site of an enzyme, they are combining together into one product. And enzymes have lots of different illustrations. They don't actually look like this. They look a lot more like that folded final structure of a protein that we discussed, but sometimes those are so complicated that illustrators will just make it very simplified. So you'll see enzymes modeled and illustrated in lots of different ways. And then the second type of reaction is called a decomposition reaction, when molecules are broken apart to form smaller products. So here we have one large substrate with a bond between these 2 molecules, and after they join the active site of the enzyme, that enzyme is able to break that bond and we end up with 2 products. That's a decomposition reaction. So enzymes are constantly working in your body. So here are a couple of examples of reactions that use enzymes in your body. Lactase is an enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is a type of sugar found in milk, during digestion. And some people have faulty lactase enzymes, which makes them lactose intolerant. So that lactase enzyme is obviously very important. And then another example is helicase, which is an enzyme that unwinds DNA strands for copying during cell division. And we'll get into that more later in the semester. So in summary, chemical reactions are necessary for the survival of living organisms. Enzymes are a special type of protein that changes one molecule, called a substrate, into another, a product, with less activation energy than if the reaction had occurred on its own.